Welcome to Freedom to Learn, the podcast that champions choice in education, defends parental rights, and exposes the harm caused by school unions. I'm Jenny Gentles, Director of Education Freedom and Parental Rights at DFI, the Defense of Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C. Last week brought a roller coaster of highs and lows in the education policy world. On the negative side, the nation's report card for 2024 was released, revealing that our K-12 education system is failing to educate students. Only 30% are scoring as proficient, and about 40% lack even basic reading and math skills. Students have not recovered academically since the dramatic declines during pandemic school closures. And let's be honest, the results weren't great when students were tested in 2019 either. Our guest today will share more. But on the positive side, policymakers are taking steps to turn the system around so we can improve outcomes for kids. Tennessee was the first state out of the blocks this year and has already passed a groundbreaking Universal Education Savings Account, or ESA, program. Last week in the U.S. Congress, Senators Cassidy and Tim Scott and Representatives Adrian Smith of Nebraska and Burgess Owens of Utah reintroduced the Educational Choice for Children Act, ECCA, with the goal of including it in budget reconciliation. Congress also celebrated the 20th anniversary of the federal D.C. Opportunity Scholarship Program. And over at the White House, the president signed multiple education-focused executive orders, including one supporting education freedom. He concluded the week by hosting a National School Choice Week roundtable with governors and other policymakers. Joining us today on Freedom to Learn is Mark Schneider, the former director of the Institute of Education Sciences, to explain how NAEP works, what the test score trends reveal, and just how concerning the 2024 results for 4th and 8th grade students really are. He also shares his proposal for a federal moonshot investment in getting reading instruction right and discusses the future of IES, especially as the conversation around dismantling the U.S. Department of Education heats up. Mark brings a wealth of experience to this conversation. He served as director of IES for 6 years, was a vice president at the American Institutes for Research, and served as commissioner of the National Center for Education Statistics. Mark Schneider, welcome to Freedom to Learn.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
We're going to dig right into the nation's report card, or NAEP. What is it, and what did we see last week?
So the National Assessment of Education Progress, NAEP, is self-styled the nation's report card. Congressionally mandated assessments of 4th and 8th grade in reading and math take place, and there's a large sample of students across the nation. It reports on the national trends. It reports on subgroups, like, for example, Black and Hispanic students or students with disabilities. It reports on state performance, and it reports on large urban district performance. That's often called main NAEP, and it's really the most expensive and extensive work that NAEP does. It does 12th grade reading and math every 4 years, but not at the state level. It does science, geography, and writing on a more infrequent basis than every 2 years. The test itself is useful in terms of being a report card. It is less useful in terms of research purposes for many reasons, in part because it does not have individual student scores. But it does cast a light on how the nation is doing especially with regard to reading and math. The other thing is it measures education progress or lack thereof. NAEP started, depending on which subject, decades ago. It became a different beast, one that we know today. It became that in 2002 with the No Child Left Behind law, which established the 2-year cycle for reading and math at grades 4 and 8 and the 12th grade every 4 years.
So we had NAEP results in 2019 for math and reading, 4th and 8th grade, that came out before school districts closed schools for prolonged periods during the COVID era. We had results again in 2022. The nation was pretty shocked, those who were paying attention to NAEP in the nation's report card, that those results were pretty devastating. We were hoping for good news in 2024, but not feeling too optimistic. Those test results for 4th and 8th grade reading and math were released January 29th. Can we trust these results?
Yes, you can trust them. Can you be happy with them? No. I think that everybody was hoping that the 24 results would show some recovery from 22. After all, we have spent $180 billion on recovery money, and the results were pretty much a disaster. So there are a couple ways of thinking about this, but overall scores did not recover, which again, after $180 billion in several years, we should have expected and hoped for some better returns. That's number one. But we have to put this in, especially reading, in context. So I was the commissioner for the National Center for Education Statistics in the mid-2000s, and every 2 years we released the NAEP results, and it was like great because every time we released NAEP results, the scores went up. Somewhere around 2011, they stopped going up and they became flat. And somewhere around 2017, they started, especially in reading, they started to decline. So it's 2017 looks like an inflection point where the reading skills of American students in 4th and 8th grade started deteriorating. 2019 was slightly worse than 2017, but on a downward trajectory. 22, as you noted earlier, was like, oh my God, what have we done, right? And everybody was hoping that the 24 results would show recovery, which they did not.
They did not. And so a lot of the pushback online seems to be to question the NAEP results. My sense is that because those NAEP scores have been trending down, as you said, there are going to be more people within the K-12 system questioning the validity of NAEP. But should we be doing that?
So first of all, for what it is, NAEP is valid. I mean, I don't think there's a question of that. So it uses rigorous sampling theory to identify schools and students that should be tested. So the validity of the sample, I think, is beyond question. But we sample all the time for many, many things, right? Polling data, for example, which is usually pretty accurate, is based on samples, right? Market research is based on samples. So the sampling theory is actually quite good. And the validity of NAEP for what it is, I don't think could be questioned. I do not accept any arguments that the trend line going down is some artifact of NAEP. I think it's a product of a failing education system.
We agree at Defense of Freedom Institute and have been saying so. Let's talk about that evidence of a failed K-12 education system. And I want to dig in a little bit more about what the 2024 results reveal about the state of K-12 education in the U.S. According to the New York Times, the American children's reading skills reach new lows. Heckinger report says a dismal report card in math and reading. Chalkbeat says struggling students just posted their worst NAEP reading scores in 32 years. This might be difficult to communicate in an audio podcast, but Mark, could you walk us through the 2024 results and what they revealed?
I'll just talk mostly about 4th grade reading because it's so critically important. Early reading really matters. Students that start falling behind in early years reading, very hard to catch up. And then from my own perspective, if you cannot read by 4th grade, you're going to have trouble by 8th grade. You're going to be even further behind in 12th grade. And then our whole society is built on the ability to read, even though YouTube and TikTok and all those things are probably in part the reason that scores have been going down since 2017. And maybe in some future world, reading is an art, like sometimes I think of myself as a priest of a dying religion, literacy, right? I mean, maybe we won't need it in the future.
I don't accept that.
I don't accept it either, but you're part of the priesthood of the religion called literacy, right? I mean, I cannot imagine a life in which you cannot read a story or a novel and find that the world that's opening up incredibly important to your intellectual well-being and to your emotional state. Let me just do two comparisons. So NAEP has levels called achievement levels. So there's a basic level, there's a proficient level, and an advanced level. In the basic level is pretty much in reading, pretty much the foundation of literacy, right? I mean, I could give you definitions of what these things are, but you could look them up. And it's like, if you're below basic, if you can't identify what characters in a novel or a story do to each other, I mean, how they interact and describe it is like, what, you're not getting the depth, the feeling of a story. And that's one of the characteristics or criteria for fourth grade basic. And then we can go to proficient, and then proficiency and above, right? So we, in 2002, in the No Child Left Behind, the nation embarked on a campaign that turned out to be quixotic. That was a literary reference, by the way. To have the nation at 100% proficient, right, in reading and math, and instead of what we have right now in 2004. We have something like 40% of American students are below basic in reading, and only about 30% are proficient. So we have more students. We have more students who are below basic than we have students that are proficient. This is in fourth grade reading. The pattern is exactly the same in eighth grade. I think the difference is a little smaller. Okay, so and then we can start looking at, like, what kinds of students are in the below basic category. So over half of American Black students, about half of American Hispanic students, and about 50 some odd percent in the low 50s of students that are low income, that's classified by the free and reduced price lunch. All three of these groups are below, the majority of this are below basic. So Blacks represent 15% of American students, Hispanics 23%, free and reduced price lunch about 60% of American students. So we're talking about three huge categories of students, right? Half of which are below basic. The other group is students with disabilities. 70% of fourth graders that have IEPs or 504s, 70% are below basic. So the way I think about this is as follows. We've taken large swaths of American student populations and we say, sorry guys, you can't read. Well, and it doesn't get any better by eighth grade. It doesn't get any better by 12th grade. So we are now taking huge segments of the American population and we're saying, oh, you can't read. Well, the American economy is booming, right? We have spent billions of dollars on microchip factories that we want to build them in Arizona. Hopefully we have water there, right, and electricity. But what we won't have, if we keep up these patterns, is we're not going to have welders, we're not going to have electricians, we're not going to have workers to build these fabs, the fabrications for microchips. I mean, this is crazy. We can't just write off so many groups of our students and just say, hey, half of you can't read. Sorry.
Well, Mark, I appreciate that you're calling attention to the students who are below basic. I think we spent a number of years always focusing on proficiency, and I've always wondered if people kind of tune that out. Well, I don't really know what you mean by proficient or where that bar is set. And so I don't know why I should care that 70% of students aren't proficient readers. But when we're talking about below basic, this is heartbreaking stuff. These are students, as you said, they can't understand who is the main character, what's the motivation of the main character. They don't have the ability to read in a functional way. So we're not even taking away the path to college or a professional career. We're taking away all kinds of opportunities. So appreciate you calling attention to that. I hesitate to bring up math because I think we've got some really bad news when it comes to eighth grade math in particular. Any comments on math?
So look, we're talking about the two most fundamental skills that our school system is supposed to impart, right? And I would say the exact same thing about math as I just said about reading, right? And we can look at eighth grade math was a disaster. Both fourth and eighth grade reading were disasters, right? Fourth grade math was bad, but not a disaster. Only in comparison to the other subject areas. Yeah. So again, what are we doing? I mean, I know it's like a stupid question. Like, what are we doing? How are we turning out students who can't even do basic arithmetic? Right. So in fourth grade, one of the examples of a fourth grade basic task is to put a number on a number line. I mean, how much more basic could you get than that?
Oh, I looked up some of the other tasks, and anybody can do that. There are sample questions on NAEP, and sometimes it is finding the midpoint on a number line between 70 and 80. Again, very basic task.
There's an international exam called the Program for International Assessment of Adult Competencies, and that came out just a few months ago. And that actually measured the numeracy and literacy of American workers. We should not be surprised that when we're looking at students in K-12 schools, that they're falling so far behind in reading and math, and then we go out and test adults, and we find the exact same thing, right? It is clear that a large segment of American adults in the workforce, this is what PIAC focused on, can't do arithmetic. And just like in the NAEP scores, where the bottom is falling out, the worst students are getting left further and further behind. It's in PIAC, which we did in 2011, I think, and then just this year. It's the lowest performing adults that are falling further and further behind.
But what do you mean by falling further behind?
They can't do arithmetic.
Right, and there's a gap that's broadening between their performance and higher performers.
That's right. We see this in NAEP. I'll just name some other alphabet tests: TIMSS, the International Math and Science Survey, and PISA, the Program for International Student Assessment. This gap is growing, where the higher performers are not at a level that we want, but they're pretty much steady, and the bottom performers are like getting worse and worse and worse. The bottom is falling out.
You mentioned that you were the commissioner for the National Center for Education Statistics, NCES, which oversees NAEP, but you were also the head of the Institute for Education Sciences, IES, which oversees NCES. Lots of acronyms. Let's talk about IES. Where do you think IES does a good job, and where do you think it could do better?
So let's just focus on the reading for a second, okay? So let's roll back to 1997. There was something called the National Reading Panel was established and ran for 3 years. Okay, the motivation there was that A, reading scores in the United States were flat, and B, the science of reading had progressed far long enough so that we could actually have a National Reading Panel that tried to use the science of the times to improve flat scores. So that ran from 1997 to 2000. And then in around 2005, the IES launched something called Reading for Understanding. There was a $130 million project. So that's about $250 million in today's dollars. They did 6 concerted efforts that were aimed at improving the science of reading. That lasted for several years. And in fact, what happened was that helped, that Reading for Understanding helped move the science of reading from point A to point B. And that was a major accomplishment, right? The science of reading is no doubt way, 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 way better than it was now than it was before Reading for Understanding. So that was an expensive project that actually worked. Roll forward to 2024, for example, right? So the NCER, the National Center for Education Research, which is the major avenue, the major vehicle for funding research projects in the nation, it spent $102 million last year in 2024. It funded 42 projects at 102 for a total of $102 million. If you look at them, these 42 projects are almost all one-offs, right? We do one study here, we do one study there, we do another study there, and another study there. Okay. That is not the way a mission-driven research organization should focus. In contrast, what would happen if it said, look, here's our goal. 40% of American fourth graders are below basic. In 5 years, we're going to cut that in half. And we're going to spend $100 million, $200 million, whatever we can to aim at that mission-driven goal. And we're not going to do this thing over here or that thing over there. We have one major goal: reduce the number of students, the percentage of students that are below basic by half in the next 5 years. Maybe it's a moonshot, but a moonshot ended up with people on the moon. So instead of doing $102 million of 40 one-offs, say the mission of the Department of Education is to increase literacy. That's one of the major focuses of the department. IAS is going to spend as much money as it could put together on a drive, on a moonshot that's actually going to succeed in doing something that the nation really needs.
What can Congress do to ensure that something like that happens?
A few years ago, we were trying to get ARPA Ed established. So ARPA is the Advanced Research Program in the Department of Defense. Everybody loves DARPA, right? It's done microwaves, it's done the internet, it's done all kinds of really important things. And they work on pretty much the model that I just noted, right? Here's a moonshot. We're going to spend 5 years doing this. At the end of the 5 years, we're going to evaluate it. If it worked, great. If it doesn't work, okay. We have to accept failure as an outcome. So ARPA Ed was included in the reauthorization for IAS that never passed the Congress. But there was report language that said IAS should spend $40 million on DARPA-like activities. Right? Boom. IAS spent $40 million on DARPA-like activities. So if Congress said, and it doesn't have to be legislation, it could be report language, it could say, we recognize how bad literacy is in the United States and the growth in the percent of students that are below basic is unacceptable. It's a security risk. It's a national security risk, right? We want IAS to spend $40 million, $100 million, whatever it is, right, on a concerted effort to implement is the key here, implement the science of reading, to monitor the implementation and improve the implementation of the science of reading. And I say implementation is really important because we know what happens, right? We have the science of reading. We have the best science of almost anything that education does with regard to reading. And we've had it for a long time. I'm going to give lots of kudos to Emily Hanford and sold the story. I mean, I think she's done more than anybody that I know of to get the science of reading to affect 40 states right now.
I hear you, Mark. I bring her up whenever I can. Sold a Story is a podcast series that had an incredible impact on state legislatures and them finally turning this around. But it's decades after we knew what needed to be done. So
that's why it's the emphasis has to be on improving the science, right? But the science is pretty solid already. It has to be on why is this not being implemented? Why is it, for example, that even though we've known about the science of reading and the importance of phonics, someone like Lucy Calkins, who has an endowed chair at Teachers College, which is supposedly the number one education school in the country. So, and she's been selling junk science forever. So why is this?
Lucy Calkins was very skilled at marketing, but not at teaching reading. And unfortunately, millions of students suffered as a result. Okay, so I hear what you're saying. You're saying IES needs to buckle down and focus on implementation of good research.
So we're at a particular cusp, once again, with regard to the science of reading. And so what we need to do is we need to instantiate the science of reading in things like AI-driven tutors, right? I don't think there's no way that tutors, AI tutors, are going to take the place of teachers, especially in early grades. But how do we tap into this burgeoning power of AI to do individualized tutoring? That's the goal. I mean, again, we should never think that these are going to replace teachers. But the fact of the matter is AI-driven tutors can and have been proven to have major effects. So how do we build on that science, right? So how do we couple the expanding uses and expanding power of AI with tutors? How do we implement those breakthroughs, which are going to happen? How do we implement those breakthroughs in schools? How do we support teachers who can't therefore improve the reading instruction? That is, I don't even think that's a moonshot, right? That's maybe low Earth orbit because we're close enough, right? We could do it.
I like hearing some, I don't want to say good news. That's not good news. It's a good idea. and hopefully down the road, we'll have some good news. Final question, a little controversial, in that the Department of Education is potentially on the chopping block, according to some discussions out there. Just given the conversations around dismantling the U.S. Department of Education, do you think that IES and its components should be allowed to continue?
So it's hard to imagine, right? It's hard to imagine a world in which we're not supporting research in education. So let's back up for a second about the entire Department of Education. So first of all, it's the smallest cabinet level agency. And it was created as a reward in 1979 to teacher unions, which had supported Jimmy Carter in his quest for the presidency. So we always have to keep that in mind. So it's always been strongly supported by teacher unions, and teacher unions strongly support more money given to the Department of Education, right? So it's a sort of a mutual admiration society. However, it is half of the budget for the Department of Education is federal student aid, right? These are people that could not implement a simple repair update of FAFSA, which was the single largest point of failure in the history of the Department of Education, because it affected millions of real people trying to get something from the Department of Education. It was a total disaster. So there's lots of discussion about moving FAFSA to the $1.7 trillion debt into the Department of Treasury, which has much more experience and expertise doing money, governing money. So that's half of the department, right? So the National Center for Education Statistics, the closest thing to it would be the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which has a much stronger record of timely information that actually is important to markets. So we could move the National Center for Education Statistics to the Bureau of Labor Statistics and create the Bureau of Labor Education Statistics. Bless. There are parts like the regional education laboratories and the comprehensive centers that are regional efforts, and they overlap in such a way that nobody I know could understand why do we have these two regional offices, and the legislation is almost identical. So now we have these two things. In the National Science Foundation, the National Science Foundation has these regional innovation engines. So there's yet another regional specific activity. And so one possibility would be to move the National Center for Special Education Research into the EDU unit of NSF. That's most of what, if we move NCS to BLS and create BLESS, and if we move the NCR and the Special Ed Research Unit to NSF, so there's only one more center left, and that's the National Center for Education Evaluation. And that evaluates federal programs in education. That could go to NSF also, if that's where the education research is being done. I've written about this. I think we could imagine, and a lot of other stuff that the department does could go into state block grants, because states are more important, and they should be increasingly more important than they are at the current time.
I think what you're saying is that IES's components should continue. There's opportunities to move them if the department is dismantled, and maybe there's opportunities to move them, merge them, improve them, even if the department isn't dismantled.
So the improvement part, no matter what happens in terms of the future of the Department of Education, IES needs to do better. There's no question. I was director for 6 years, so I blame myself for a lot of the failures. I mean, COVID came along, and then, that was over a 2-year hole in my tenure. And then and you know as well as I do that even post-COVID, getting anything done was incredibly difficult, because we had all these rules that allowed government workers never to show up. So we had 180 people on staff. And on Mondays, these numbers fluctuate, of course, but on Mondays, 10 people would show up. On Tuesdays, 20 people. Wednesday, back to 10. Thursday, 25. And Friday, me. That was it.
Yeah, traffic was better in D.C., but as far as taxpayers getting their money's worth out of government, not so much. Mark, you mentioned that you've written about these issues. Where can we find your work?
The one about dismantling the Department of Education is in a magazine called The 74. So you can just Google Mark Schneider and education. If you don't put education in that, you're going to end up with some random Mark Schneider that does jewelry.
Well, Mark, thank you for your commitment to getting education research right, and thank you for joining Freedom to Learn.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Freedom to Learn is a production of the Defense of Freedom Institute. You can learn more about DFI at dfipolicy.org. If you have feedback or suggestions for future podcasts, please reach out to us at podcast@dfipolicy.org. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe and leave a rating and review wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.